Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ink Kavat. It's a country smaller than the city of New York, but it's also one of Asia's biggest success stories. Why does Singapore maintain one of the region's best equipped and best trained militaries? Joining us to discuss this are Alexander Huang, Council on Strategic and Wargaming Studies Chair and Kuomintang International Affairs Director, and Wen-Ti Sung, Atlantic Council China Hub Non-Resident Fellow. Very warm welcome to both of you on the show today.
Thank you.
In 1963, after independence from the UK, Singapore and Malaysia entered into the Federation of Malaysia, a union along with others including North Borneo and Sarawak. And yet, less than a year later, racial riots broke out, which quickly led to Singapore leaving the Union and forming its own independent state in 1965. In the 60 years since then, the city-state has become one of the wealthiest nations per person and built one of the best militaries in the world. A staggering 25% of its tiny 5 million plus population are either active duty armed forces or reservists. In 2024 and 25, Singapore will spend around $20 billion on defense, equivalent to Taiwan and 5 times as much as its neighbor Malaysia. So Alex, let me come to you first. Exercise Wallaby, which has just concluded, unilateral exercise. That's in Queensland, Australia, and it was extended from 6 to 9 months this year. There's over 6,000 troops which take part in it. Now, new to this year is the Spider ground-based surface-to-air missile system, along with Singapore's Hunter armoured fighting vehicle. So this is not your average military. Why is it that Singapore needs to defend its territory, be armed to the teeth to defend its territory?
As you have described it, Singapore is a tiny city-state and with a very, very limited territorial air and water. So it has to be very sensitive, very strong to maintain its independence and national sovereignty. And secondly, given its limited, land for training, that if you want to have a first-class military and operational capability, Singapore had long ago seek, foreign territories and in the friendly country to conduct their training. For the recently completed military exercise, I think it's a reflection to the fact that the Indo-Pacific is a focal point of global tension, and especially against the Chinese expansion.
And Wen-Ti, we talked about the sort of recent situation with Alex. In what historical context should we see the defense build-up by Singapore?
I think Singapore, like Alex pointed out, is a small state, of course, which means that it has relatively little defense depth. Of course, we know the circumstance of Singapore's emergence as a state, which is one where its independence was not an entirely, completely voluntary decision in that sense, which is also why I think as a ethnically diverse island country, it does find a strong need to further strengthen its capacity for internal balancing as well to deter, but also a capacity for external balancing. And that's why we see them try to seek out more and more security partnership with other states, be it India, Australia, US, and many others, as a way to further strengthen that capacity.
Now, Israel's military actually helped design Singapore's military. What would you say the two countries share in common?
Well, the parallel, I think, is one of an ethnic factor. I think Israel obviously finds out to be a predominantly Jewish state in a sea of Arabs, essentially. And for Singapore, obviously it's become a lot more diverse these days as well. But when it first emerged, for many it was seen as a once predominantly Chinese state in the Sea of Malay. So in that sense, it will obviously take a little bit more work in terms of relationship building with its neighbors to ensure that its acceptance, its place in the region is seen as legitimate and accepted.
And Alex, I mean, what exactly is it that Singapore is worried about in terms of attacks to its territory? Who are they expecting? You mentioned China, but are they really worried about China attacking them?
I think we can look at it from two different angles. The first one is the traditional tensions with Malaysia, and that translated somewhat into their internal ethnic divide. But on the other hand, the compulsory military service is a way or an approach to make a more, collaborative or integrated, society. And I think because of its limited territorial sea and water, any move, when a fighter jet take off, is almost hit another country's, neighbors' territorial air. So it has to maintain a kind of relationship with Malaysia and Indonesia. Both are Muslim countries. Another angle is their responsibility. Singapore is a key actor in the Strait of Malacca and a major choke point for international maritime route. So I believe it has also its own responsibility for a low end to deter piracy, for a high end to protect and defend the freedom of navigation and sea lanes of communication.
Right, good point. Let's talk now about the relationship with the US. So in 2026, Singapore will receive the first of its, the US's most advanced fighter jet, the F-35s. Why does Singapore get to be in this club?
I think Singapore, by virtue of its location at the Malacca Strait, really has an important strategic weight. In geostrategy, we call it a pivot point on the global strategic chessboard. And so in that sense, I think Singapore has strong importance. Some 60% or so of international maritime commerce go through Malacca Strait, and really also is the gateway that connects the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, and therefore give it a special place in the American-led Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think for that sense, Singapore has good reason, a good incentive it provides the U.S. in terms of trying to get Singapore onto the good side of the U.S. So one factor then is that security cooperation. I think U.S. still believes and still has enough confidence that it will still be seen as a security partner of choice for Singapore, and that Singaporean position in any regional rivalry will still be one that comes down more closer to the U.S. side. So in that sense, U.S. has reason to help out Singapore.
Right, I see. And Alex, so what does the presence of that logistics hub, the U.S. logistics hub, what does that mean for the U.S. presence on the Malacca Strait and in the region?
As we have discussed, Singapore holds the very important strategic location. Its value is well known by all parties. I think the United States' relationship with Singapore is not only looking at the American presence, it's also something that the United States wanted to show to the regional actors that their presence. Singapore had been a hub or a maintenance center for United States aircraft carriers for decades already. So I think when the United States export their most advanced, combat aircraft, they must find a trusted partner that had a very good track records in keeping the high tech, close to the United States.
Because it's on a par actually with South Korea and Japan, the other Asian nations that are receiving or have received F-35s. But Singapore is not a treaty ally, but it seems to be treated as if it were a treaty ally.
I think Singapore, in most of the American defense planners, ideas that they are Singapore is a strategic partner, and the strategic location determined that Singapore must be a partner.
Now, new Singaporean Prime Minister Lawrence Wong has warned about the intensifying rivalry between the US and China. He says that it's actually Singapore's single biggest geopolitical concern. Maintaining good relations with both is a priority for Singapore, but also an increasing challenge. Now, significant diplomatic meetings, such as the historic 2015 Cross-Strait Summit between the leaders of Taiwan and China, Ma Ying-jeou and Xi Jinping, and the 2018 Donald Trump-Kim Jong-un Summit, demonstrate Singapore's high exposure to both the US and China Now, earlier this year, Singapore took the unprecedented step of citing its Foreign Interference Act in the case of Hong Kong-born Singaporean Philip Chan, designating him as a politically significant person, with Singapore's Home Affairs Ministry saying he showed a susceptibility to being influenced by foreign entities and a willingness to advance their interests. Wen-Ti, how would you define or how would you characterize Singapore's relations with China? And what does Singapore mean to China?
I mean, Singapore, I think it has a largely what I call a dual alignment posture towards China and the US. It does want support from both countries for sure, but at the same time, it knows that when the relation between the US and China were good, it was easier to be friends with both. When rivalry escalates, it then has to find a way to still get on the good side of both. So far, we've seen Singapore trying to de-link its security relation with the US from its economic relations with China. That worked for a while as well, but in recent years, we've seen increasing secularization of economic ties as well. When we begin to hear talk about economic security, de-risking from economic to technology, which owe to them, to US especially, increase has security implications. So China and Singapore relation has been a bit more tense lately.
Okay. Is it just economic versus security though? I mean, we talked about Singapore being essentially a Chinese-speaking or culturally Chinese amongst Muslim countries.
It's a fine balancing act for Singapore to juggle, I think. Definitely a lot of linguistic cultural similarity between China and a huge segment of Singapore's population. Again, it's a multi-ethnic state, so we don't just call it Chinese state or anything. And but of course, that also means that there's a lot of exchange programs. We know that the Chinese Communist Party, for example, for the longest time, they've been sending a lot of officials to China, to Singaporean universities for exchanges, executive training at NTU, NUS, and places like that. So definitely exchanges, perhaps that also can mean opportunity for united front work broadly defined. So I think that's also one reason why Singapore is becoming a bit more alert in recent years. Again, difficult balancing act to juggle, but let's see where to go with it.
Mm. And Alex, I mean, China and Singapore also carry out joint military or maritime drills,
Yes.
annual exercises. You know, I want to ask you the question, what does Singapore mean to China?
I think it means a lot, but if we look at the joint exercise, for people like Wen-Ti and me, you know, we knew it. It's been in practice for many, many years. There occasionally you will see the Chinese warships docking at Changi, harbor, and for leisure and for port call. So it is totally not a surprise to me because we knew for a long time that Singapore provide fair ground and provide professional service for multilateral, Navy and visitors. So I think that's their strategy. In addition to that, I think, since late 1980s, there are tons of, academic papers and research on, the linkage between China and Singapore and how the Singapore model can help China transfer from autocracy to authoritarian, democracies. That kind of article.
Mm.
Yeah.
And let's talk about that a little bit later. But sort of back to the Malacca Strait. So if the US supports the Singaporean military because of Singapore's strategic position, China also has very deep, as we discussed, links with Singapore. So when it comes to China's so-called Malacca dilemma, what side would Singapore take during a wartime scenario?
I think even before Lawrence Wong, I think Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has stated many, many times in his international forum speech that Asian countries, Singapore, does not like to be forced to choose side. But more and more policy deliveries in recent years, since the US-China strategic competition, I think Singapore is more leaning toward to the so-called liberal democracies, like-minded countries, more on the U.S. side, especially when talking about dealing with the Chinese expansionism. Not only Singapore, but all states surrounding the Malacca, the Strait of Malacca, they knew that in the extreme environment that they have to help the United States to do something to help the entire region. That's a unspoken understanding, and I think I don't want to say they have chosen side, but it's very clear that democracies stand together.
Okay, now in the 60 years since its independence, Singapore has become one of the wealthiest nations per person, surpassing its former colonial master, the UK, and even the United States in GDP per capita. It's also the biggest global financial center in the Asia Pacific and the third in the world behind New York and London, holding over $5 trillion in bank assets and insurance net premiums. The Malacca Strait is one of the busiest corridors for global trade, with 90,000 cargo ships passing through it and more than $3 trillion in global trade each year. Now, beneath the sea, Singapore holds a critical role as a global data hub, controlling numerous subsea cables and housing 3 data centers. So, Wen-Ti, Alex mentioned the Singapore model. It's been held up by leaders across the world. What is the secret to Singapore's success? We mentioned some of it, of course. What else is there?
Singapore definitely has been one of the leading success stories in Asia, in economic rise, and many other aspects as well. I think Singapore, again, it's a small state, which means that in terms of autonomous local indigenous resources, it cannot really compete with huge countries like Russia, US, for example. What Singapore lacks in size, it makes up with traffic. And that is to say that Singapore, economically, when it's trying to compete, it tries to present itself as a convening ground where different interests, different actors, different goods and services can come here, mingle, and remix and upgrade themselves. So in that sense that if you want to be a convening ground for different interests, you need to make sure that there are fair set of rules so that everybody will want to play your game, which is why that rule of law in Singapore really has been one of the defining features for the city-state. And that's why that economically is being very successful. And that, of course, also has ramifications for the political side as well. We see Singapore becoming a convening ground for major security conversations, like the Shangri-La Dialogue, for example, for Asian security, where US, China, many other countries feel comfortable hanging out in Singapore, and that in turn gives Singapore a lot of additional outsized influence.
Alex, rule of law is something that we associate with democracies. Now, Singapore has often been mischaracterized as a one-party dictatorship superimposed on a free market and a free market economy, and nowhere more than China by the Chinese Communist Party, and they often, cite Singapore as a justification for authoritarian rule. Why is that?
I think clean government, high efficiency of public service, and a very strict implementation to the higher bar of rule of law. And the Singaporeans understand that that's the standard that they need to survive. If they can maintain such level of governance and the political environment, that's how they can survive, and that's how they can attract investment.
But why does the CCP think that they have authoritarian rule, that there's a single-party dictatorship?
I think, it's an academic debate that how people define the Singaporean style of democracy, but it is far, far away between the Chinese governance and how Singapore has run. Singapore has free elections. The fact that one party had been re-elected for decades, never been voted out, doesn't mean that in each election that they do not have any challenge that the ruling party would never worried. So I think as we move on, there will be more diversity, there will be more pluralism, and that's also a challenge to the future of Singapore as well.
Wen-Ti, is it because, as Alex said, the same party has ruled for 60 years?
I mean, I think there's a distinction to be made here, of course, between a one-party political system by fiat versus a one-party system that emerges as a result of elections. And I think what Singapore does have are comparative procedural democracy featuring elections. And of course, it's something to be said about, I think, being a small island democracy, whether they are able to come up with rules and institutions that's going to help enhance the degree of competition in the system over time. But I think that's something that many democracies around the world are working on as well.
Yeah, and so how hard would it be for China to emulate the Singaporean system?
It may be challenging for China. I mean, China obviously under the Xi Jinping era, especially at one time, really tried to send lots of officials to Singapore for training. So much so that at one point, if you talk to Chinese scholars about 10, 15 years ago, they would joke that NUS and NTU are basically Chinese party school number 2. Sorry, Chinese CCP party school.
National University of Singapore.
NUS, NTU, basically Singaporean universities, with so many students that were essentially CCP officials that they were joking it was sort of like CCP party school or Southeast Asian branch. Of course, quite exaggeration, but back to the main question, I think the broader issue here is that Singapore does have vigorous rule of law on which the whole country's livelihood stand on. Rule of law
and transparency, I assume, as well.
Indeed, I think that's part and parcel, a natural result of that. But rule of law is something that's not quite prized in China to the same way. What they have in China today is what they call rule by law, more than rule of law.
Alex, so given Singapore's, status, as we've spoken about, its success, its status, how would you characterize its role in the region?
I think Singapore stands out as a financial center, as a most stable, one of the most stable political system, and a country that welcomes foreigners. Its border is wide open, and more importantly, I think Singapore is always and has been trying to take a larger role in the ASEAN organization. And they wanted to work, in some specific areas that they can play as a leader in the ASEAN as a whole. It's a representative to ASEAN on some issues, and a fair ground for many. So I think it's for many countries with diverse views and interests. They would see Singapore as a fair ground and harmless, so they can, do something extra, in the name of in Singapore. So that's the benefit and the uniqueness of Singapore.
Okay, and we talked about Singapore and the Malacca Strait and the Malacca Dilemma, or China's, and also, the US's control or presence around the Malacca Strait. And Alex mentioned that, when it comes down to the line, liberal democracies will group together. I want to ask you, Wen-Ti, beyond the Malacca Strait, in any possible Taiwan contingency, we've spoken about Singapore having one of the strongest militaries in the region. How do you think, it would, but it's also got Chinese roots and very strong trade ties. Which side do you think it would come down on if it had to choose?
It's a multi-layered question that requires a multi-layered answer, I think. I think for Singapore, obviously the best case scenario is to not be forced to choose. And certainly when things are good, when general atmosphere between US and China are relatively benign, it can get away with being friends to both. Now, when things do go south, when relationships get worse between US and China, and it has to choose, then Singapore had the issue of perhaps people will think that friends to all may be friends to none. And so I think if really things go south, if a security, even a conflict breaks out in Asia between US and China, my guess would be that Singapore will try to take a middle but lean toward US direction. What that could mean is that during wartime, I imagine Singapore will be happy to provide some kind of humanitarian assistance to help out casualties of war. And over time, that's going to become a broad umbrella under which you have mission creep, and that will gradually expand to logistical support. And that, I think, eventually, if it absolutely has to choose, Singapore will still find itself closer to the US side than the Chinese side.
Oh, okay. Very final question, Alex. So Lawrence Wong, he also warned that Singapore is vulnerable to the realignment in global supply chains, essentially trying to realign away from China, though that impact hasn't been felt yet in Singapore. To what extent do you think that China actually relies on its status, on its global standing, on China, because it is the gateway to China from the West, so connecting the West to China?
Well, compare all the investment from all over the world inside China. Singapore is not the top investors in China. Of course, there are vigorous business exchanges, but Singapore also hosted all the major outflow of capitals from China. Yeah. Actually, Singapore benefited from those in the past several years. So I think Singapore should not be worried that much about, given its geographical location, shouldn't be worried that much about a kinetic, China threat.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much, Alexander Huang and Wen-Ti Sung, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our show. Thank you for watching Taiwan Talks today.